While cleaning the Millionaire's office in a luxury mansion, the cleaning lady froze upon seeing her mother's photo in a black frame. Julianne wiped her brow as she stood in the cramped kitchen of her modest home, the scent of reheated leftovers mixing with the faint smell of cleaning supplies that always lingered in the air. It was a constant reminder of the job she had to juggle just to keep things together. Life had never been easy for her, but recently, the weight on her shoulders seemed heavier than ever. Her 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, sat at the small dining table, scribbling on a piece of paper with crayons. Her bright smile and innocent giggles were the only moments of joy that broke through the endless strain. Julianne adored her daughter. She was the light in an otherwise dim existence. But that didn't change the harsh reality of their situation. Between her work as a cleaning lady and the care she needed to provide for her mother, who was bedridden with a worsening illness, Julianne felt like she was always falling behind. "Mom, look at this." Lucy held up her drawing, a picture of the two of them holding hands in front of a big house with a sunny sky above. Julianne forced a smile as she glanced at the artwork, her heart aching. A big house. Sunshine. Things that seemed so far out of reach. "That's beautiful, sweetie," she said, kissing Lucy's head. "Maybe one day." But deep down, Julianne wasn't sure how that day would ever come. The bills kept piling up. The medical expenses for her mother were more than she could handle, and her hours as a cleaning lady weren't enough to make ends meet. Most nights, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could keep this up. Their neighbor, Mrs. Mildred, was a godsend. The elderly woman had lived next door for as long as Julianne could remember, always offering a kind word and, more importantly, helping to watch Lucy when Julianne had to work late. Mildred's presence in their lives was a comfort, a reminder that not everything in the world was cruel or unforgiving. That morning, Julianne had made her usual rounds to check on her mother before heading out for work. The sight of her mother in bed, frail and pale, gnawed at her every day. It was hard to reconcile this woman with the vibrant, strong mother she had once been. "Don't worry about me," her mother had whispered weakly. "Just make sure you take care of Lucy." "I'm trying, Mom," Julianne had replied, her voice thick with the frustration she tried to keep hidden. "I'm trying." Now, as she stood in the kitchen, her thoughts were pulled back to the reality of her day. Julianne's new job cleaning a mansion on the outskirts of town had brought some hope. Though, it wasn't just any mansion, it was the home of Grant Weston, a reclusive millionaire with a reputation for being as cold as the marble floors he walked on. The pay was better than most cleaning gigs, and even though Julianne hadn't seen much of Grant yet, she was thankful for the opportunity. Every penny mattered, and this job felt like a small lifeline in an ocean of overwhelming problems. "Time to go, Lucy," Julianne said, snapping herself out of her thoughts as she glanced at the clock. "I'll drop you off at Mrs. Mildred's and head to work." Lucy bounced up from her chair, her energy unshaken despite their daily struggles. Julianne admired that about her daughter, the way she could find joy in the smallest things, even when life felt impossibly difficult. After getting Lucy settled with Mrs. Mildred, who greeted them with her usual warm smile and a plate of freshly baked cookies, Julianne drove to the Weston mansion. The sprawling estate sat far from town, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and tall iron gates that gave the property a sense of isolation. It was worlds away from the life Julianne knew, a stark contrast to the small, decluttered home she and Lucy shared. As she parked her car in the staff lot and walked toward the back entrance, she couldn't help but feel a pang of inadequacy. The grandeur of the house reminded her of how far she was from any semblance of stability. The tall columns, the pristine windows, the sheer size of it all. It made her feel small, insignificant. She entered through the service door, greeting the other staff members with polite nods as she slipped into her role for the day. Today, her task was to clean the offices upstairs, a part of the house she hadn't yet seen. Climbing the marble staircase with her cleaning supplies, she felt a nervous flutter in her chest. Everything about this place was intimidating, and the thought of accidentally breaking something worth more than her entire paycheck made her palms sweat. As she reached the second floor, the air was different. Quieter, more refined. Julianne took a deep breath and began her work, starting with dusting the bookshelves in one of the smaller studies. The room was decorated with rich, dark wood and thick carpets that muffled every sound. It felt like the kind of place that held secrets. She moved to the large desk at the center of the room, her eyes drifting to the items on it, pens, papers, and a photo. Julianne's hand froze mid-wipe as her gaze locked onto the frame. It was old, the edges of the black and white photo slightly worn. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. The woman in the picture, it was unmistakable. It was her mother, younger, smiling in a way Julianne had rarely seen in her lifetime. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a lump formed in her throat. Why would there be a photo of her mother in this house? What did it mean? Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood there, holding the picture, overwhelmed by confusion and emotion. Before she could even begin to process what was happening, the door to the study creaked open, and she heard footsteps approaching. "Excuse me," a deep voice said. Julianne turned sharply, her hands trembling as she realized who stood in the doorway. Grant Weston, the man who owned the mansion, was staring at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. And she was standing there, tears in her eyes, holding a piece of his past she had never known existed. Julianne's heart raced as she stood frozen, her hands still gripping the old photograph. Grant Weston's presence filled the room like a cold draft, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, darted from her face to the photo in her trembling hands. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "What are you doing with that?" Grant's voice was firm but not aggressive, more curious than accusatory. He stepped further into the room, his gaze not leaving the frame she held. Julianne swallowed hard, trying to compose herself. She hadn't meant to invade his privacy. She was just doing her job. But now, she stood before him, caught in a moment she didn't fully understand. Why was her mother's photo here, in this mansion? What was the connection? I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to pry, it's just, the woman in this picture, it's my mother." She hesitated, still unsure if she should even be speaking to him about something so personal. "I didn't expect to see this here." Grant's brow furrowed deeper. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he took a closer look at the photo. His reaction was not what Julianne had expected. Instead of anger, his face softened, almost imperceptibly, as if a distant memory had been stirred. "Your mother?" His voice was low, filled with a hint of disbelief. He stared at the picture for a long moment before looking back at Julianne. "What's her name?" "Anna," Julianne replied quietly. "Anna Harper." Grant remained silent, his eyes distant as if the name had transported him to another time. Julianne shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room nearly unbearable. She had so many questions swirling in her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. Finally, Grant exhaled and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. He seemed conflicted, as if struggling to put together the pieces of something long forgotten. "I haven't seen this photo in years," he said, almost to himself. Anna was someone I knew a long time ago." Julianne's breath caught. Someone he knew. There had to be more to it than that. She could see the weight of emotion in his expression. This wasn't just a passing acquaintance. She was important to you, wasn't she?" Julianne's voice was tentative, but she couldn't stop herself from asking. The question hung in the air like a fragile thread between them. Grant hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly before he nodded. "Yes, she was very important to me," he admitted quietly. "We were close, but we lost touch, and I never saw her again." Julianne's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. Her mother had never spoken of anyone named Grant, at least not that she could remember. Why had they lost touch? What had happened between them? "Why did you lose touch?" she asked, before she could stop herself. It was an intrusive question, and she immediately regretted it, but the need for answers was overwhelming. Grant's expression darkened slightly, and he seemed to retreat inward, his posture stiffening. "I don't know," he said, his voice distant. It was complicated. Julianne could sense that there was more to the story, but it was clear that he wasn't ready to share it with a stranger. She bit her lip, unsure of what to say next. The silence stretched between them again, heavy with unspoken questions. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment, handing the photo back to him. "I didn't mean to bring up anything painful. I wasn't expecting to see my mother's picture here." Grant took the photo from her, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief second. He glanced down at the image, his face softening once more. "No, it's all right. I'm just surprised." There was something about the way he said it, surprised, as if this photo had stirred something long buried. Julianne felt the urge to ask more, but the atmosphere was too charged, and she didn't want to push him further. "I should get back to work," she said, taking a step back toward her cleaning supplies. "Again, I'm sorry for all this." Grant nodded slowly, still staring at the photo. "No need to apologize," he said quietly. "If anything, I owe you an explanation, but not right now." Julianne wasn't sure what that meant. Would he tell her more later? Did she even want to know? She wasn't sure. But something told her that whatever had happened between Grant and her mother was bigger than she could imagine. "Thank you," Julianne said softly, unsure of what else to offer. She gathered her things and made her way out of the office, her mind still spinning from the encounter. As she closed the door behind her, she leaned against the wall in the hallway, taking a deep breath. What had just happened? Grant Weston, the millionaire who barely spoke to anyone, had not only recognized her mother, but had shared a piece of his past with her. It was clear that there was so much more to the story, but Julianne wasn't sure how to handle it. As she returned to her cleaning duties, her thoughts kept drifting back to that photo, to the way Grant had looked at it, and to the words he hadn't said. What had happened between him and her mother all those years ago? And why had her mother never spoken of him? Julianne knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the conversation. It was only the beginning of something much deeper, something that would change everything she thought she knew about her mother and possibly her own life. Julianne couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Grant as she finished her shift. The image of her mother smiling in that photo, young and carefree, was burned into her mind. Who was Grant to her mother? Why had her mother never spoken about him? The questions spun in her head relentlessly as she drove home to pick up Lucy from Mrs. Mildred's. Lucy greeted her with a big smile, holding up another one of her crayon drawings. This time it was a picture of their small home, but instead of their usual life, there was a huge mansion in the background. "Look, Mom, that's where you work." Lucy beamed, clearly fascinated by the idea of her mom cleaning such a grand place. Julianne forced a smile and knelt to hug her daughter. "It's very pretty, sweetheart. You've got all the details just right." Mrs. Mildred chuckled from the kitchen. "She's been talking about that big house all day. I think she wants to visit you at work someday." Julianne smiled, though the thought of bringing Lucy to the Weston mansion felt overwhelming. Maybe one day, if Mr. Weston allows it. The evening passed quietly. Julianne tried her best to focus on Lucy's needs and her mother's care, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Grant. When her mother had first fallen ill, Julianne had tried to get her to talk more about her past, hoping to understand more about her life before Julianne was born. But her mother had always been vague, often changing the subject or brushing off questions with vague answers. Now, Julianne felt like she was staring at the missing piece of a puzzle, a piece she hadn't even known existed. As she sat by her mother's bedside later that night, listening to the faint sound of her labored breathing, Julianne found herself wondering what her mother would say if she asked her now. Would she even remember Grant? Would it be too painful for her to talk about? "Mom," Julianne whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Do you remember someone named Grant Weston?" Her mother stirred slightly, but there was no response. Julianne bit her lip, torn between letting her rest and pressing for answers. But the memory of the photo gnawed at her. The look in Grant's eyes when he had mentioned her mother. There was something there, something she needed to know. Before she could push further, Lucy came padding into the room, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Mom, can I sleep with you tonight?" Julianne smiled softly. "Of course, sweetheart." She scooped Lucy up and carried her to the small bed they shared, settling her down before climbing in next to her. As Lucy drifted off, Julianne lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts once again returning to the mansion and the photo. The next morning, Julianne returned to work with a strange mix of anxiety and curiosity. She didn't know what to expect. Would Grant say anything more about her mother? Would he avoid the subject entirely? She wasn't sure if she should bring it up again, or if she should just let it go. But something inside her wouldn't let her rest until she understood the connection. As she entered the mansion, she went about her duties as usual, but her mind wasn't on the cleaning. She kept glancing toward the office, wondering if Grant would be there again. Would he be thinking about the conversation they had? Would he be willing to share more? By midday, Julianne was called upstairs to clean one of the guest rooms. As she worked, she caught a glimpse of Grant walking down the hallway, talking quietly on his phone. He didn't look in her direction, but the brief sight of him sent her heart racing. There was something about him, an air of sadness, of unresolved pain, that she hadn't noticed before. She wondered if it had always been there, hidden beneath his cold exterior, or if the conversation about her mother had brought it to the surface. Later that afternoon, Julianne found herself back in the office, the same room where she had discovered the photo. She hesitated before stepping inside, half expecting to see Grant waiting there, but the room was empty. The photo was still on the desk, now carefully placed back in its frame. She couldn't resist walking over to it again. Her eyes lingered on the image, and the questions started flooding back. What had her mother's life been like before Julianne was born? What had gone so wrong that she and Grant had lost touch so completely? Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Julianne jumped, her heart racing. Grant stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I see you found your way back here," he said quietly, his voice more measured this time. Julianne took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She couldn't keep dancing around it. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, "about how this photo ended up here, about how my mother knew you and why she never told me." Grant's gaze softened, and he stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking about it too," he said, walking over to stand beside her. "About how everything happened. It wasn't supposed to end like that." Julianne swallowed hard, her mind spinning. "What do you mean?" Grant sighed, leaning against the desk as he looked down at the photo. "Your mother and we were young. I loved her more than anything. But something happened. Something that I still don't fully understand. One day she was just gone, and I never knew why." Julianne's heart sank. She could hear the pain in his voice, the way his words carried years of confusion and regret. "She never spoke of you," she said softly, shaking her head. "I don't understand why." "I don't either," Grant replied. "But I think it had something to do with my father." The mention of his father made Julianne tense. She had heard rumors about the late Weston patriarch, a man known for his cold, controlling ways, but she hadn't expected him to be part of this story. "What do you mean?" Julianne asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grant's eyes darkened. "I think my father had something to do with why we were separated. I don't have proof, but I've always had a feeling. And now I need to know the truth." The weight of Grant's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Julianne stood frozen, absorbing the revelation about his father's possible involvement in separating him from her mother. It was a lot to take in, too much perhaps, and her mind struggled to piece it all together. "Your father?" Julianne echoed, her voice trembling. Why would he do that? Grant looked away, as if ashamed to speak the truth out loud. My father was a very controlling man. He always had a plan for my life, for the family business, for everything. He didn't believe in distractions. And, at the time, your mother and I were very serious. Julianne blinked, trying to process the implications of what he was saying. But that doesn't explain why she never told me, why she kept all of this hidden. I don't know, Grant admitted, his voice low. I've spent years trying to understand it. When she left, it felt like my entire world collapsed, and I never got any closure. I tried to reach out, but there was no trace of her. She was just gone. Julianne could hear the sadness in his voice, the bitterness of never knowing what happened. She suddenly felt a wave of sympathy for him, despite the confusion and questions still swirling in her mind. His father had interfered in their lives, just like so many wealthy, powerful men do, believing they could control everything and everyone around them. But why now? Julianne asked softly. Why is this all coming up again after so many years? Grant ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated. I don't know, he repeated. But seeing you, finding out that you're her daughter, it feels like I'm being given a second chance to understand what happened, to make things right, if I can. Julianne didn't know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to dig deeper, to uncover the whole truth right here and now, but another part of her was overwhelmed. It was too much to process in one sitting, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear everything. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the photograph. I wish my mother could tell me, but she's so sick now. She barely talks. I don't know if she even remembers. Grant's expression softened, and for the first time, Julianne saw genuine concern in his eyes. I didn't know she was ill. Julianne nodded, her throat tightening. Yeah, it's been tough. She's been sick for a while, and the treatments, well, they're expensive. She didn't know why she said that. Maybe it was because she was used to opening up to people like Mrs. Mildred, or maybe it was because Grant seemed different now, less of the distant millionaire she had imagined and more of a man weighed down by his own pain. Either way, the words slipped out before she could stop them. Grant's jaw clenched, and he looked like he was struggling with something internally. If there's anything I can do to help? Julianne shook her head quickly. I'm not asking for your help, she said firmly. This isn't your problem to fix. I know, Grant said, his voice calm but insistent. But it doesn't feel right, knowing what I know now. Your mother? She meant a lot to me, and if there's any way I can help her now, after everything. Julianne felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to accept charity from Grant, but at the same time, the reality of her situation was stark. Her mother needed help, and Julianne was running out of options. Still, the idea of being indebted to him, especially now, with all these emotions tangled up, made her hesitant. I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. Grant nodded, not pushing the issue. He seemed to understand the delicacy of the situation, and for that, Julianne was grateful. There was a long pause, the silence thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Grant broke it, his voice softer now. Do you think she'd talk to me? Julianne stared at him, surprised. My mother? Grant nodded. If I could speak to her, maybe she remembers more than you think. Maybe she can tell us what really happened. Julianne hesitated. The thought of Grant coming to her house, meeting her sick mother, felt strange, too intimate, too personal. But at the same time, there was a part of her that wanted him to know. If her mother had truly been the love of Grant's life, didn't he deserve some kind of closure? I don't know if she's up to it, Julianne admitted. Some days she's more lucid than others, but if you want to try, I can ask. Grant's expression was unreadable for a moment, but then he nodded. I'd appreciate that. Julianne felt her heart pounding. This was all happening so fast, too fast. But what choice did she have? There was something about Grant, something in the way he spoke about her mother, that made Julianne want to help him find the answers he was seeking. "I'll let you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't make any promises." "I understand," Grant said, standing up from the desk. "And Julianne?" "Thank you." Julianne blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For not pushing me away," Grant said quietly. "For letting me explain." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded, gathering her cleaning supplies and heading toward the door. Her mind was spinning as she left the room, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her chest. As she made her way back through the mansion, Julianne couldn't help but wonder how this would all play out. Would her mother even recognize Grant? Would she remember the love they once shared? And what would it mean for Julianne if she did? One thing was certain. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The thought of Grant visiting her mother weighed heavily on Julianne as she drove home that evening. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and her mind raced with what might happen. What if her mother didn't recognize him? Or worse, what if the visit stirred up painful memories that would make her condition even worse? By the time Julianne arrived back at her house, she was emotionally drained. Lucy was sitting on the couch, watching cartoons, while Mrs. Mildred hummed softly to herself in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The familiar comfort of their modest home brought Julianne a small sense of relief, though it didn't last long. "How was work, dear?" Mrs. Mildred asked as Julianne dropped her keys on the counter. Julianne hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure how to even begin explaining the strange day she had just experienced. "It was complicated," she finally said, running a hand through her hair. Mrs. Mildred raised an eyebrow, her wise eyes searching Julianne's face. "Complicated how?" "I found out something about my mother," Julianne said, her voice quiet, "something I wasn't expecting." Mrs. Mildred put down the spoon she'd been using to stir the pot of soup and turned to face Julianne fully. "What did you find out?" Julianne took a deep breath and explained everything. The photo, the conversation with Grant, the possibility that his father had been the one to separate her mother and Grant all those years ago. Mrs. Mildred listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every word. "That's quite the revelation," Mrs. Mildred said when Julianne finished. "No wonder you're all tied up in knots about it." Julianne nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "He wants to talk to her," she said softly. "Grant wants to see my mother, to ask her what really happened." Mrs. Mildred's brow furrowed, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "Do you think that's a good idea? Your mother's not in the best shape for visitors, let alone someone who could bring up old wounds." "I don't know," Julianne admitted, her voice shaky. "But what if it helps her? What if remembering him makes her happy, even for just a little while?" Mrs. Mildred studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "It's a gamble either way, but maybe you're right. Maybe it's worth a try." The conversation left Julianne feeling even more uncertain, but she couldn't stop thinking about the possibility. What if seeing Grant again brought her mother some closure, or at least some peace? And what if it helped Grant find the answers he'd been searching for all these years? That night, after putting Lucy to bed, Julianne sat by her mother's side. The rhythmic sound of her breathing was a quiet reminder of how fragile everything had become. She held her mother's hand, staring at the woman who had raised her, the woman who had sacrificed so much to give Julianne a better life, despite their struggles. "Mom," Julianne whispered, not expecting a response. "I found someone who knew you a long time ago." Her mother didn't stir, her breathing steady but shallow. Julianne squeezed her hand gently. "His name is Grant Weston," she continued, her voice soft. He said you were important to him, that you were close." There was no reaction at first, but then, after a long pause, her mother's hand twitched ever so slightly in Julianne's grasp. Julianne's heart skipped a beat. Was it a coincidence? or had she actually heard her? "Grant," her mother whispered, the word barely audible, her voice raspy and faint. Julianne gasped, sitting up straighter. "You remember him?" Her mother's eyes remained closed, her face still peaceful, but her lips moved again, forming the name as if it were a memory long buried. Grant. Tears filled Julianne's eyes. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected any kind of response. But there it was. Her mother remembered. Even after all these years, even with her mind clouded by illness, that name still had meaning. The next morning, Julianne found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at her phone, Grant's number glowing on the screen. She had promised to call him if her mother showed any signs of remembering. But now that the moment had come, she felt paralyzed by indecision. What if bringing him here was a mistake? What if it made things worse? But then she thought of her mother whispering his name in the quiet of the night, and she knew what she had to do. Taking a deep breath, Julianne pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Grant picked up. "Julianne?" His voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying tension. "She remembers you," Julianne said, skipping the pleasantries. "She said your name last night." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Grant spoke again, his voice was filled with quiet emotion. "She did?" Julianne nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Yes, I think you should come, if you're still willing." "I'll be there," Grant said without hesitation. "Just tell me when." They agreed on the next afternoon. After ending the call, Julianne felt a mixture of relief and anxiety wash over her. This was happening. Grant was going to meet her mother again after all these years. The following day, Julianne's nerves were on edge as she waited for Grant to arrive. Mrs. Mildred had taken Lucy out to the park for the afternoon, sensing that this was something Julianne needed to handle on her own. Julianne paced the small living room, glancing every few minutes at the clock. When she heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway, her heart jumped into her throat. She opened the door just as Grant was stepping out of his sleek black car. He looked different today, more vulnerable, less guarded. There was a softness in his expression that Julianne hadn't seen before. "Thank you for letting me come," he said as he approached her, his voice steady but quiet. Julianne nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "She's resting right now, but you can sit with her if you want." Grant followed her into the house, his gaze sweeping over the modest surroundings. He didn't seem uncomfortable, just contemplative. Julianne led him to her mother's room, where the soft sound of her breathing filled the small space. For a moment, Grant just stood there, looking at her. His eyes filled with emotion as he took in the sight of the woman he had once loved, now frail and weak in the bed. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Anna," he whispered. Julianne stepped back, watching from the doorway as Grant slowly approached her mother's bedside. She wasn't sure what she expected to happen, but the tenderness in his voice, the way he spoke her mother's name, stirred something deep within her. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past crashing into the present. Julianne could feel the weight of years of separation and regret filling the room, and she knew whatever happened next would change everything. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Julianne's mother's breathing, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Grant stood beside the bed, his eyes locked on Anna's frail form, as if the years of separation between them were being bridged by the simple act of being in the same room again. Julianne watched from the doorway, unsure of how to feel. A part of her wanted to give them privacy, but another part of her felt deeply connected to this moment. "Anna," Grant whispered again, his voice barely above a breath. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch light, as if afraid she might break under the weight of his presence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Julianne held her breath, wondering if this was a mistake. Maybe her mother was too far gone, too weak to recognize the man standing in front of her. Then, slowly, Anna's eyelids fluttered open. Julianne's heart skipped a beat as her mother's eyes focused, first on the ceiling, then shifting toward the figure standing at her bedside. It took a few seconds, but Julianne saw the moment recognition dawned on her mother's face. Her eyes widened, and she tried to sit up, her frail body straining with the effort. "Grant!" Anna rasped, her voice weak but unmistakable. Grant's breath hitched, and Julianne saw a tear slip down his cheek. "I'm here, Anna," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I'm here." Anna's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at him as if she were seeing a ghost from her past. I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Grant knelt beside the bed, his face inches from hers, as if trying to close the gap that had been created by years of separation. "I didn't know what happened," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to find you. I tried, but you were just gone." Anna's eyes filled with sorrow, and she shook her head weakly. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered, her hand gripping his as tightly as she could manage. "It was your father." Julianne's heart froze at her mother's words. She had suspected that Grant's father had been involved in their separation, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it come from her mother's own lips, sent a chill down her spine. "My father?" Grant asked, his voice sharp with confusion. "What do you mean?" Anna's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, and Julianne could see the strain this conversation was putting on her. She moved closer, standing at the foot of the bed, torn between wanting to protect her mother and needing to hear the truth. "Your father didn't want us to be together," Anna whispered. He said I wasn't good enough for you, that I would ruin your life, ruin your family's reputation." Grant's face twisted in disbelief, his hand tightening around hers. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that can't be true." Anna's gaze softened, and she gave him a sad smile. "He loved you, Grant, in his own way. But he was afraid that I would hold you back, that I would tarnish the Weston name." Tears welled up in Grant's eyes, and he looked down at the floor, as if the weight of the revelation was too much to bear. "He told me he didn't know why you left," Grant said bitterly. "He lied to me." Anna nodded weakly. "He sent me away, paid me to disappear. I had no choice, Grant. I had nothing. No one to help me." Julianne's stomach churned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mother had been forced to leave the man she loved, to give up everything, because of one man's prejudice and greed. Grant stood up, pacing the small room as if he couldn't contain the flood of emotions racing through him. "He never told me," he muttered, almost to himself. All this time I thought you had just left me." Anna's eyes followed him as he paced, her expression filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Grant," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't fight him. I couldn't." Grant stopped suddenly, turning to face her again, his eyes burning with anger and regret. "I don't care about the Weston name," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I never cared about any of that. All I wanted was you." Anna's tears flowed freely now, and she reached out toward him, her hand trembling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I wanted to tell you, but by the time I could, it was too late." Julianne felt her own eyes stinging with tears. She had never seen her mother like this, so vulnerable, so broken by the weight of the past. It was almost too much to bear, and yet she couldn't look away. This was a moment she had never imagined, a moment that was unraveling the very fabric of her understanding of her family. "Grant," Julianne said softly, stepping forward. "I didn't know any of this. She never told me. I don't think she wanted me to know." Grant turned to face her, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "But now I do." There was a long silence as the weight of the truth settled over them all. Grant seemed lost in thought, his mind clearly reeling from the revelation of his father's betrayal. Julianne felt a strange sense of relief that the truth was finally out, but also a heavy sadness for the years that had been lost because of one man's selfish decisions. Finally, Grant broke the silence. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I can make things right now." Julianne blinked, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" Grant turned to face her fully, his expression filled with determination. "I'm going to help you, Julianne. Your mother, Lucy, all of you. Whatever you need, I'm going to make sure you have it. Medical bills, housing, everything." Julianne stared at him, shocked by the suddenness of his offer. "Grant, I don't know what to say. I don't want to be a charity case." "You're not," Grant interrupted firmly. "This isn't charity. This is me trying to make up for what my father did. He may have taken everything from you, but I won't let that happen again." Anna, her eyes half closed now from exhaustion, whispered softly, "Thank you, Grant." Julianne felt a lump rise in her throat. The past had been cruel to her mother. But now, with Grant's help, maybe they could find a way to move forward. Maybe there was hope after all. And as she looked at Grant, she realized that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Julianne. Grant had stayed true to his word. He was relentless in making sure that her mother's medical bills were handled and that the best care possible was provided. Doctors came in and out of their small home, each one more competent than the last, and there was a sense of relief that settled over the household. Julianne, for the first time in months, allowed herself to breathe a little easier. But with that relief came a new kind of tension. Julianne couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too fast, that accepting help from Grant meant giving up some part of her independence. She had spent so long trying to keep her head above water on her own, juggling jobs, taking care of Lucy and her mother. Depending on someone else now felt foreign, almost wrong. Sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, Julianne stared at a pile of medical documents Grant had taken care of. The words blurred together as her mind drifted. She still couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, Grant Weston had been nothing more than a distant figure, a wealthy man who barely crossed her thoughts. Now, he was woven into the fabric of her life in ways she never could have imagined. A soft knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to find Mrs. Mildred standing there, wearing her usual warm smile and holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. "Thought you could use some company," Mrs. Mildred said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She set the plate on the table and took a seat across from Julianne, her eyes scanning the documents scattered in front of her. "Looks like things are finally turning around," Mrs. Mildred said softly, though there was a hint of something in her voice that Julianne couldn't quite place. Julianne nodded, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Yeah, Grant's really stepped up. I don't know what to make of it all." Mrs. Mildred tilted her head, studying her with those knowing eyes. "You don't think you deserve the help?" Julianne bit her lip, unsure how to answer. It wasn't that she didn't think she deserved help. It was more that she had spent so long doing everything on her own, and now, with Grant stepping in, she felt like she was losing control. It was a strange feeling, being grateful yet conflicted at the same time. "It's just a lot," Julianne admitted, her voice soft. "I've been doing everything myself for so long, and now he's here, fixing everything. And I don't know how to feel about it." Mrs. Mildred reached across the table and placed a hand over Julianne's. "You've been strong for so long, dear. There's no shame in letting someone else be strong for you for a while." Julianne's eyes stung with unshed tears. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, even with people she trusted like Mrs. Mildred. But what if it all falls apart again? What if this is just temporary, and I end up right back where I started? Mrs. Mildred smiled gently. "Life is full of uncertainties, Julianne, but that doesn't mean you have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders alone. letting people in, accepting help. It doesn't make you weak, it just makes you human. Julianne nodded slowly, her thoughts swirling. She knew Mrs. Mildred was right, but that didn't make it any easier to let go of the fear that had been her constant companion for so long. The next morning, Julianne arrived at the mansion for work as usual, but this time there was a different energy in the air. As she entered through the back door and made her way upstairs, she couldn't help but feel the change in her dynamic with Grant. Their relationship had shifted from employer and employee to something more complicated. And while he had been nothing but kind and considerate, Julianne still felt a knot of uncertainty in her chest. When she reached the office to begin her cleaning duties, Grant was already there, sitting at his desk. He looked up as she entered, offering her a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's your mother today?" he asked, his voice quiet but sincere. Julianne set down her cleaning supplies, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. "She's stable. The doctors say she's improving, but it'll take time." Grant nodded, seeming to take in the information. There was a pause, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," Grant said suddenly, standing up from his desk and moving toward her. "About everything. About what's happened between us, between our families." Julianne's heart skipped a beat. She had known this conversation was coming, but she still wasn't sure she was ready for it. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything," Grant continued, his voice firm. "I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Because my father took so much from your mother, and from you." Julianne looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "I know that, Grant, and I appreciate everything you've done. But it's hard for me. Accepting help, I've always done things on my own." Grant stepped closer, his expression softening. "I get that. I do. But you don't have to do everything on your own anymore. I'm here, and I want to help, not just with your mother's care, but with whatever you need." Julianne felt a lump rise in her throat. It was so tempting to let go, to lean on someone else for once. But the fear of losing control, of relying on someone who might not always be there, held her back. "I don't want to feel like I'm indebted to you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're not," Grant said gently. "You don't owe me anything, Julianne. This isn't about debts or obligations, it's about making things right." There was a long pause as Julianne processed his words. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the burden of her life alone. "Okay," she finally said, her voice steady but quiet. "I'll let you help." Grant's shoulders relaxed, and a genuine smile spread across his face. "Thank you," he said softly. "And if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, just let me know." Julianne nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and vulnerability wash over her. This was new territory for her, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. Days passed, and while the tension around Julianne's mother's health eased with the ongoing care and medical support, a different kind of tension began building inside her. Accepting help from Grant had brought relief, yes, but it had also awakened an undercurrent of confusion, guilt, and uncertainty that Julianne hadn't expected. She had spent so long guarding herself, protecting her heart from disappointment, and relying only on her own strength. Now, having someone else, someone like Grant, offer her help so freely left her feeling off balance. It wasn't just about the money or the care he was providing for her mother. It was the emotional weight of everything that had come to light. The revelations about their families, about her mother's past with Grant, had made their relationship far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Every time she saw him now, Julianne felt a pull, a connection, that was as unsettling as it was undeniable. One evening, after tucking Lucy into bed, Julianne sat alone in the small living room, the flicker of the television casting faint shadows across the walls. She couldn't focus on anything, not even the TV show she'd put on as background noise. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Grant, to the way he had looked at her during their conversation that morning. His eyes filled with a sincerity that both comforted and unsettled her. She was grateful for everything he had done, for her mother, for her daughter, and for her. But there was something more lingering beneath the surface, something she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. It wasn't just about fixing the mistakes of the past. It was about what their lives could become now that they were connected in such a profound way. A soft knock at the door pulled Julianne from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, there he was. Grant stood on her porch, his hands in his pockets, his expression somewhere between hopeful and hesitant. "I'm sorry for showing up unannounced," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the night air. I needed to talk to you." Julianne nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "It's okay. Come in." Grant walked inside, his presence filling the small space. He glanced around the room, his eyes briefly landing on the framed photos of Lucy and her mother that lined the shelf. He seemed different tonight, quieter, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I've been thinking," Grant said after a long pause, his voice low. "About everything. About what happened between our parents and how it's affected both of our lives. And I realized I've been so focused on trying to fix things for your mother, for you, that I haven't stopped to think about how you must be feeling in all of this." Julianne blinked, caught off guard by the direction of the conversation. "I'm fine," she said quickly, out of habit more than anything else. Grant shook his head. "No, you're not. You've been carrying the weight of everything. Your daughter, your mother, your job, and now all this. It's too much for one person, Julianne." She opened her mouth to protest, but Grant continued, his voice soft yet firm. "I know you're strong. I've seen that from the beginning. But I don't want you to feel like you have to be strong all the time, especially not now, not with me." The honesty in his words hit Julianne harder than she expected. For so long, she had believed that she had to be the one to hold everything together, that showing vulnerability or accepting help would somehow make her weak. But hearing Grant acknowledge her struggles so openly, so compassionately, made something inside her crack. "I don't know how to do that," Julianne whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been taking care of everyone for so long. I don't know how to let someone else in." Grant stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to do it all at once," he said gently. "But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore." Julianne looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, walls meant to protect her from disappointment, from heartbreak. But those same walls were keeping her from accepting the help and support she so desperately needed. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I'm scared of what might happen if I let myself rely on someone else. What if it all falls apart? What if I lose everything again?" Grant's expression softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You won't lose me, Julianne. I'm not going anywhere. I promise." The sincerity in his voice, the warmth of his touch, it was enough to make Julianne's heart ache with a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that maybe this time things wouldn't fall apart. But the scars of her past, of being abandoned, of struggling alone for so long, made it hard to let go of the fear. Grant seemed to sense her hesitation, and he didn't push. Instead, he simply stood there, offering her the quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Julianne allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her own. "I don't know how to do this," Julianne said softly, her voice trembling. "But I want to try." Grant smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that made her feel a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "That's all I'm asking." They stood there in the quiet, the weight of the past slowly giving way to something new. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was a significant one. Julianne wasn't sure what the future would hold, But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have to face it alone. As Grant left that night, Julianne sat on the edge of the couch, her mind swirling with thoughts. The emotional obstacles she had been facing, her fear of relying on someone, her fear of letting someone in, hadn't disappeared. But for the first time, she felt like she had taken a step toward breaking down those walls. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Julianne allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't have to be strong all the time. A future where she could rely on someone else, where she could trust that things might be okay after all. The following weeks moved in a blur of routine, emotions, and the slow but steady improvement of Julianne's mother. The doctors were optimistic, and though her mother wasn't getting better quickly, there was progress. It was enough to give Julianne a glimmer of hope. But as life often does, that sense of calm didn't last. It was late in the evening when Julianne heard the sound she feared most, a sharp, strangled cough coming from her mother's room, followed by the unmistakable wheezing of labored breaths. Panic flooded her chest, and she rushed to her mother's side, her heart pounding in her ears. Her mother lay in bed, her chest rising and falling erratically, her skin pale and clammy. "Mom?" Julianne's voice trembled as she knelt by the bed, taking her mother's cold hand in hers. "Mom, can you hear me?" Her mother's eyelids fluttered, but her breathing grew more strained with each passing second. Julianne's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and called the doctor who had been overseeing her mother's care. She explained the situation as calmly as she could, though the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. The doctor told her he'd be on his way immediately, but as Julianne ended the call, she knew that every second counted. Lucy, who had been sleeping in her room, woke up to the commotion and padded into the hallway, rubbing her eyes. "Mommy, what's happening?" she asked sleepily, her small face filled with worry. Julianne forced a reassuring smile, though inside she was breaking. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "Why don't you stay with Mrs. Mildred for a little while? I need to take care of Grandma." Lucy nodded, sensing that something serious was happening. She disappeared down the hallway toward their neighbor's house, leaving Julianne alone with her mother. Julianne's hands trembled as she wiped her mother's forehead with a damp cloth, trying to keep her calm, even as the fear gnawed at her insides. She'd been so focused on making sure everything was in order, on accepting Grant's help, on finding some semblance of stability, that she hadn't allowed herself to truly acknowledge just how fragile her mother's condition was. And now, it seemed like everything was falling apart. The minutes ticked by painfully slowly as Julianne sat by her mother's side, praying for the doctor to arrive soon. But her mother's breathing grew more labored, more shallow. Tears welled up in Julianne's eyes, and she found herself whispering softly to her mother, trying to keep her calm. "You're going to be okay, Mom," Julianne whispered, though her voice cracked with the effort. "You're strong. You've always been strong." But her mother's response was faint, almost a sigh. "I'm tired, Julianne." The words hit Julianne like a blow to the chest. Her mother had always been a fighter, always determined to push through, no matter how hard things got. Hearing her say those words that sounded like she was giving up, made Julianne's heart ache with a pain she hadn't been prepared for. "Don't say that," Julianne pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please don't say that. You've come so far, we're finally getting things back on track." Her mother's hand tightened weakly around hers. "I know, but sometimes it's okay to let go." Julianne shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I'm not ready. I can't lose you, Mom." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of her mother's uneven breaths, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, her mother said, "Grant, he'll take care of you." Julianne's breath caught in her throat. Even in the middle of this crisis, her mother was thinking of Grant, of the man who had once been the great love of her life, the man who had stepped back into their lives after so many years, bringing with him both healing and heartache. "Don't worry about me," Julianne said softly, brushing a stray hair from her mother's forehead. "I'm going to be fine, but I need you to keep fighting. Please." Before her mother could respond, the door swung open, and the doctor rushed inside, followed by 2 nurses. They immediately began checking her mother's vitals, their movements efficient and practiced. Julianne stood back, her heart racing as she watched them work, feeling utterly helpless. "We need to take her to the hospital," the doctor said, his tone calm but urgent. "She needs more advanced care than we can provide here." Julianne nodded, her chest tight with fear, as the nurses prepared to move her mother onto a stretcher. As they wheeled her out of the house, Julianne quickly grabbed her phone and dialed Grant's number. Her hands shook as she waited for him to answer, the sound of her mother's shallow breaths echoing in her mind. Grant picked up after the first ring. "Julianne?" "It's my mom," Julianne said, her voice trembling. "She's not doing well. They're taking her to the hospital." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Grant spoke again, his voice was filled with concern. "I'm on my way." At the hospital, the hours stretched on endlessly. Julianne paced the waiting room, her nerves frayed, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Every time a doctor or nurse walked past, her heart skipped a beat, hoping for news, but dreading what that news might be. Lucy was with Mrs. Mildred, but even knowing her daughter was safe did little to ease the anxiety building inside her. She had never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of forces beyond her control. When Grant arrived, his presence was both a comfort and a reminder of how complicated things had become. He sat beside her in the waiting room, his hand resting gently on hers, offering silent support. Julianne didn't have the energy to speak, to tell him everything that was running through her mind. All she could do was sit there, her heart heavy with fear, and wait. Hours later, a doctor finally emerged from the treatment area, his expression serious. Julianne stood up quickly, her heart in her throat. "She's stable for now," the doctor said, his tone professional. "But it was a close call. We'll need to keep her here for observation, and we've adjusted her treatment plan." Julianne let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. "Thank you," she whispered, though the fear still lingered in the back of her mind. Her mother wasn't out of the woods yet. As she and Grant sat back down, Julianne leaned her head against his shoulder, exhaustion washing over her. She didn't have the energy to think about what came next, about the uncertain future that still lay ahead. For now, all she could do was be grateful that her mother had made it through the night. The next few days passed in a haze of hospital visits and restless nights. Julianne found herself in a constant state of worry, her thoughts circling endlessly around her mother's fragile condition. Though the doctors had stabilized her, there was still an ever-present sense of uncertainty. Julianne clung to the hope that her mother would recover fully, but the fear of losing her never quite left her mind. Grant had been there through it all, offering support in ways that went far beyond just covering medical expenses. He stayed by her side during long hours at the hospital, sitting quietly in the waiting room or bringing her coffee when she needed it. His presence had become a source of comfort, something Julianne hadn't anticipated, but was starting to rely on more than she realized. It wasn't until the 4th day that there was a noticeable change in her mother's condition. Julianne had been sitting at her bedside, reading quietly while her mother slept, when she noticed her breathing had steadied, becoming deeper and more even. Her skin no longer had the pale, clammy appearance that had haunted Julianne in those earlier desperate moments. There was a warmth to her complexion that hadn't been there in days. A nurse entered the room to check on her mother, and after a few minutes of examination, she turned to Julianne with a small smile. "She's improving," the nurse said softly. "It seems like she's turned a corner." Julianne's heart leapt. "She is?" The nurse nodded. "Yes. She still has a long road ahead of her, but this is a very good sign. She's responding well to the new treatment." Tears of relief filled Julianne's eyes as she looked down at her mother, who was still peacefully asleep. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long seemed to lift, if only a little. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her mother would be okay. Later that afternoon, Grant arrived at the hospital, his usual calm presence a welcome sight. Julianne met him in the hallway outside her mother's room, her emotions still raw from the news. "She's improving," Julianne said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "The doctors think she's going to be okay." Grant's face softened with relief, and he pulled her into a gentle hug. "That's amazing news," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine happiness for her. Julianne leaned into the embrace, letting herself feel the comfort of his arms around her. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. After all the fear and uncertainty, the thought that her mother might recover felt like a second chance, like a gift she hadn't been sure she'd ever receive. When they pulled apart, Grant looked at her with a tenderness that sent a warmth through her chest. "You've been so strong through all of this, Julianne," he said softly. "I know it hasn't been easy, but you've held everything together." Julianne shook her head, wiping away the tears that had started to fall. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "There were so many times when I thought I was going to break, when I didn't know how I could keep going." Grant smiled gently, his hand resting on her shoulder. "That's the thing about being strong. It's not about never feeling scared or overwhelmed. It's about getting through those moments anyway." Julianne's heart swelled with emotion at his words. She had spent so long believing that strength meant handling everything on her own, never showing weakness or vulnerability. But now, standing here with Grant, she realized that maybe strength was something different. Maybe it was about letting people in, about allowing herself to lean on someone else when she needed to. That evening, after leaving the hospital, Julianne returned home with a newfound sense of hope. Mrs. Mildred had been keeping Lucy busy during the long hospital days. But as soon as Julianne walked through the door, Lucy came running toward her with a beaming smile. "Mommy, is Grandma feeling better?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Julianne scooped her up into a hug, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "Grandma is getting better. She's going to be okay." Lucy squealed with delight, hugging Julianne tightly. "I knew it. I knew she would get better." Julianne laughed through her tears, the joy of the moment washing over her like a wave. For so long, she had been living in fear. Fear of losing her mother, fear of failing her daughter, fear of everything falling apart. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a light at the end of the tunnel. As the days went by, Julianne's mother continued to improve. The doctors were pleased with her progress, and though there were still challenges ahead, the worst seemed to be over. Julianne visited her every day, sitting by her bedside and talking with her as her strength returned little by little. During one of these visits, her mother reached out and took Julianne's hand, her eyes full of a quiet understanding that only a mother could have. "You've been through so much," her mother said softly. "But I want you to know how proud I am of you." Julianne's throat tightened with emotion. "Mom, you don't have to say that. I just did what I had to do." Her mother smiled, her grip on Julianne's hand steady. "No, it's more than that. You've kept this family together, even when it seemed impossible, and I can see how much you've grown, how much stronger you've become." Julianne blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the weight of her mother's words. It was one thing to hear others tell her she was strong, but to hear it from her mother, from the woman who had always been her rock, meant more than she could ever express. "I couldn't have done it without you," Julianne whispered, her voice breaking. "You've always been there for me." Her mother smiled gently, "And I always will be." As Julianne left the hospital that day, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her mother's health was improving, Lucy was thriving, and the weight that had once felt unbearable was slowly lifting. Life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Julianne felt like she could handle whatever came next. And with Grant by her side, she knew she didn't have to face it alone. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains of Julianne's small living room, casting a warm glow across the space. It was the kind of peaceful morning she hadn't experienced in a long time. No rushing to appointments, no last-minute panic. For the first time in what felt like forever, life was starting to feel normal. Or at least, a new kind of normal. Lucy was sitting at the kitchen table, happily coloring a picture of their family, Julianne, Lucy, and her grandmother, all smiling and holding hands. Julianne couldn't help but smile at the innocence of it, the way Lucy's world had always remained bright, even through the darkest of times. It was a reminder of why Julianne had fought so hard to hold everything together. Her mother was finally home from the hospital, resting in her bedroom, still recovering but doing much better than anyone had expected. The doctors had warned that there would still be challenges, but Julianne felt ready to face them now. She had already survived so much. What was a little more? As she stood at the kitchen counter, making breakfast, there was a knock at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. She knew by now that it was Grant. He had made a habit of stopping by in the mornings, checking in on her and her mother, offering help with anything they needed. But more than that, he had become a comforting presence in her life, someone she could rely on without hesitation. Julianne opened the door to find him standing there with his usual calm, collected demeanor, though there was something warmer in his expression now, something that had changed since they had started spending more time together. "Good morning," Grant said with a small smile, holding up a bag of pastries. "I thought Lucy might like some treats." Julianne laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "You're spoiling her," she teased, though she couldn't deny how much she appreciated his thoughtfulness. Lucy's face lit up when she saw Grant, jumping up from the table to run toward him. "Mr. Grant, did you bring me something?" she asked eagerly. Grant chuckled and knelt down to hand her the bag of pastries. "I did, but only if you promise to share." Lucy grinned and took the bag, running back to the table to inspect the treats inside. Julianne shook her head, watching the easy interaction between Grant and her daughter. It was something she hadn't expected, but it warmed her heart to see how naturally Grant had fit into their lives. After a few moments, Grant turned to Julianne, his expression softening. "How's your mom this morning?" "She's doing better," Julianne said, her smile gentle but real. "She's still resting, but the doctors are happy with her progress. It's slow, but we're getting there." Grant nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. "I'm glad to hear that." There was a comfortable silence between them for a moment, and Julianne found herself feeling grateful for the way things had changed. The chaos of the past few months had been overwhelming, but standing here now with Grant by her side, she realized how much lighter everything felt. He had been there when she needed him most, and now it felt like they were beginning to build something more than just a connection forged in crisis. Grant glanced toward the living room, where Lucy was happily munching on her pastry, and then turned back to Julianne. His expression was serious, but there was a tenderness in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. "I've been thinking," he began quietly, stepping closer to her, "about everything that's happened, about the past, and how it brought us here." Julianne's pulse quickened, but she didn't interrupt. She could see that he was gathering his thoughts, and whatever he was about to say felt important. "I spent a long time living in regret," Grant continued, his voice low but steady. "Regret for what happened between me and your mother, for the years we lost because of my father's decisions. But now I realize that I've been given a second chance, not just to make things right with her, but to start something new with you." Julianne's breath caught in her throat. She had felt it too, the way their relationship had shifted, growing from a simple employer-employee dynamic into something deeper, something that felt like it could become more. But hearing him say it out loud made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I know we've both been through a lot," Grant said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "But I think we've found something here, something worth holding on to, and I don't want to lose that." Julianne's chest tightened, her emotions swirling in a whirlwind of hope and uncertainty. She had spent so long building walls around herself, protecting her heart from the possibility of being hurt again. But Grant had broken through those walls with his quiet strength, his unwavering support, and now, standing here with him, she realized that she didn't want to keep him at a distance anymore. "I don't want to lose that either," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Grant's eyes softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Then maybe we don't have to. The warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his words, it was enough to make Julianne's heart swell with a mixture of relief and joy. For so long, she had been afraid to let someone in, to let herself believe that she could have more than just survival. But now, standing here with Grant, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future filled with love, hope, and happiness. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the possibilities of the future. And as Grant gently pulled her into an embrace, Julianne felt something shift inside her, a sense of peace, of contentment that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a dramatic, life-altering moment. It was simple, quiet, and real. But for Julianne, it was everything. Later that evening, after Grant had left and Lucy was tucked into bed, Julianne sat by her mother's bedside, reflecting on how much had changed. Her mother, though still weak, looked at peace. The lines of worry and pain that had once marred her face were softer now, replaced by a quiet acceptance. "You've been through so much," her mother said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Julianne smiled gently, taking her mother's hand. "We both have." Her mother's eyes, filled with wisdom and love, locked onto hers. "I'm so proud of you, Julianne, and I know you're going to be happy." Tears welled up in Julianne's eyes as she squeezed her mother's hand. "I hope so," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her mother smiled softly, her eyes closing as sleep began to take her. "You will be? I know it." And as Julianne sat there watching over her mother, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her mother was right. For the first time in a long time, Julianne felt a sense of hope, not just for her mother or for Lucy, but for herself. She had faced so many challenges, so much heartache. But now, with Grant by her side and the weight of the past slowly lifting, she could see a future filled with possibilities. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to embrace it.